Hello, this is Dr. Betty Rubinowitz, NextGen's Chief Medical Officer and Principal with NextGen Advisors. Welcome to our podcast. I'm joined today by my colleague Graham Brown. For today's podcast, we have a special guest. We're delighted to have with us Joanne Pugh, the founder and president of 50 Yard Line Mom. Joanne is an NFL mom. Her son Jordan played in the NFL as a safety from 2010 to 2015. Joanne is a registered nurse who is on the advisory board for the Harvard University Football Players Health Study. She's on the board of directors of the Professional Football Players Mothers Association, and Joanne is also a best-selling author, professional speaker, and players advocate. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you.
We invited Joanne to talk with us today about the results available from the Harvard Health Study. But before we get to that, since it's not every day that we get to speak with a real NFL mom, I'd love to hear from you, Joanne, what it's like to be an NFL mom. What's the best of it and what's been the most difficult part of it?
That's a great question. Very, very good question. What's the best part? I think the best part is just watching your son or your child achieve a dream. You know, I often tell the story of my son when he was, about 8 years old. And we were on vacation. We were sitting out on the beach, and he gets out of the water. He strikes a strongman pose, and he says to my husband and I am going to be an NFL player. Well, you really have to appreciate the vision of this, because he probably weighs 55 pounds at that time. And all I could say is, son, I'm going to pray for you. In the meantime, get your education. But through hard work, determination, and belief in himself, he became that less than 1%. So the best part of it is to see your child achieve a long-lasting, long-term dream. Absolutely. The challenge with it is that he achieved a long-term dream, because, I often say that you don't understand some of the challenges of what might be perceived as just a huge, which is huge opportunity, but some of the things that come along with it. And for me, being a healthcare professional, it was his overall health and well-being. I was that mom that if he played defense as a safety, if he was on the field, I found something else to do, whether it was go to the concession stand, check my phone, because I was always concerned about him getting hurt. So that was probably the greatest challenge of it all.
That's completely understandable. So let's switch over to talking about the Football Players Health Study. So the findings of that study were published August 4th in the Annals of Epidemiology. And these results were based on a survey of 3,794 former NFL players aged 24 to 89. And it was conducted as part of this ongoing Football Players Health Study at Harvard University, a research initiative that encompasses a constellation of studies designed to evaluate various aspects of players' health across the lifespan. Black, Hawaiian, and athletes from other racial backgrounds report worse physical, mental health outcomes than white players. The widest health gaps emerged between Black and white former NFL players. Black former players reported worse outcomes in all 5 health categories compared with their white peers. Social and economic advantages of playing professional football did not appear to equalize race disparities in health. So very striking opportunity here to study a very diverse group while allowing the social and economic factor to be equal among those two groups to see if there still remained differences. Did anything about these results, Joanne, surprise you?
Actually, no. And I say no because I think my greatest opportunity is that I've lived it. We often think that healthcare disparities are generalized to basic social economic conditions. I was so enamored with this study because it, again, identifies that there's greater disparities or reasons for those disparities outside of social economic conditions. Mm-hmm. And for me, this was represented by race. And I will tell you, being an African-American woman with a varied background from, socioeconomic disadvantage growing up to one now of what some would call privilege, I can tell you that myself and my family still experience some healthcare disparities. So when you take a look at these young men and men overall, former NFL players, what you find is, I believe, and this would be my experience, is that there is more to just the economic conditions of those players. There's history, the history of their engagement with healthcare providers, the history of their culture and that culture's perception of healthcare overall, and then also access. Many of these players, once they leave the league, go back to communities for which they were raised, and it could be communities that access to healthcare is not the same or equal to those that live in other communities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The answer is no, not a surprise.
Not a surprise, unfortunately.
Joanne, it's interesting to hear your response just now, because I think you touched a little bit on some of the possible reasons for the discrepancies between the outcomes that they see in this study in the white players versus Black and other races. You spoke of your own experience. Are there other factors specific to the individuals that they were studying, the actual players, the almost 4,000 individuals here that they looked at, that you think are other possible reasons for some of the discrepancies, the differences in the outcomes? Or do you think it fundamentally relies on some of those access issues, perceptions around healthcare? What else is at play?
Well, again, and I appreciate the study because it reflects on what I say my experience overall has been as a woman, as an African American, and a mother of an NFL player. And I really have to go back to the 3 points that I had referenced. I really think that it is significantly based upon your overall history, the trust that you have in terms of the healthcare system and the providers, and then access. So, and I will say information, making sure that you have adequate and accurate information. Mm-hmm. So those are the areas that I think really represents the outcomes that were found mm-hmm. from this study.
They may also in some ways represent areas of the greatest opportunity. We can't necessarily change our history, but we can look at our trust in the system, our ability to access a system, and whether we have information that is reliable, that we can consume in a way that makes sense to us. So to that end, if you were tasked with designing an intervention that really looks at how the healthcare system can remove some of these discrepancies, some of these inequities, where would it focus, and what would you have that kind of intervention undertake?
Wow, that's a great question. I believe that going into the communities, and when you go into the communities, finding the areas or those of influence in those communities. And I will say that for the African American community, I think that's the church for many. And it's really providing in-depth, accurate information, and I'm going to say debunking some of the myths. There's so much history in terms of healthcare within the African American community, as there may be with others. And it stems from some of the injustices and disservices from a healthcare perspective, mm-hmm. historically. I think we're all familiar with the Tuskegee experiment. And, when we take a look at that actual practice, that was in, 1932? That the actual study started there and ended in 1972. So you're talking about 4 years of history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think really going into the communities, educating, but I think you need a representative. When you go into disparate communities, you need someone that looks like them, that will help to instill some of the trust. I also believe that we need to educate the providers. There's a lot of maybe implicit biases that are not recognized. So really educating those providers to not only listen, but to understand and appreciate the factors that may impact their overall ability to adequately encourage and support and have part and change to the overall outcomes and disparities been realized.
Joanne, has there, in follow-up to this question, to your knowledge, have there been interventions that have been tried specifically in the NFL players context? Have they done any specific interventions in active players and maybe even with retired players? Is there any effort being introduced in that regard?
I can't specifically to any specific efforts. And again, if you take a look at the study, it said former players, right? Mm-hmm. There's opportunities for many of the players there's resources that's been provided in terms of accessing those resources to get information. More importantly, I think I go back to community. Once they have left the league, per se, I think it's the responsibility of the community and those that are advocates for those former players, such as myself, to be able to continue that education and giving information.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know that you spend a fair amount of your time being a player's advocate, and you work with young college athletes as they go into or try out for and aspire to get into the NFL. What would you say to a young African-American athlete entering the NFL today?
Well, I have a mantra, and my mantra is the NFL is a means to an end, but it is not the end. So what I would say to a player is to understand that, to internalize that, and to know that to be true. And I think as we're looking at college athletes that are taking that next step in their journey, it's really about, for me, and what I did with my son, it was to instill and encourage them to understand that you're more than just a football player. There's so many other things. I think it's real important for the community, for those that support these young men, to help them to realize they have other gifts and talents. And sometimes that's a little bit difficult to do. If you think about it, these young men, they have been playing football probably since they were 8 years old. Years and years and years of identifying themselves as a football player. I think along that journey, and what I try my very best to do is to encourage those parents, those significant others, to realize that it's so important to help your child understand that their identity is not solely football. Mm-hmm. And again, it leads to that mantra. So those are the things that I would strongly encourage. What I share with the young men and share with those that are their parents and guardians.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we had the kind of conversation before this, you had brought up the statistic, which I was struck by. I kind of knew it, but didn't. How many players enter the NFL, and it's only the very small percentage at the top who move on to great wealth or incredible fame, but they're legions of hardworking players who go through NFL careers that leave them with challenges and many successes, but that don't spend 15 or 20 years in the league. That, Tom Brady is an anomaly in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that point up. Yes, if you take a look at some statistics out there, about 85% of those players that are in the NFL were not the top draft picks. that first or second round draft pick. Now, that's what the community sees, or those that are highly visible, but you've got 85% of those players that are not. And one of the things about the 50-yard line mom is that the mission is to be a representative for those that are not as visible, not as high profile, to ensure that they have a voice. The other stat that is out there is the longevity of an NFL player. You mentioned the Tom Brady's. Very, very rare, because the average length of play in the league is about 2.5 to 3 years. So you think about that. There's a whole lot of life left after they leave the NFL. So it's sometimes an eye-opening thought. And, when we take this back and step back a bit and we talk about healthcare disparities, we have to realize that while they're in the league, obviously they're making very, very good living. But not all NFL players are very, very wealthy. Again, you've got a lot of life after you leave the league. So it's very important. I shared with my son, and I share with a lot of my audience. When you leave the league, you need to fall back on plan A, because plan B was making it to the league.
Yeah.
So that's the journey that you have from the time you start in Pee-wee football to high school to college, and then the opportunity, if you should have it, to go to the NFL. It's really about, that's plan B. What was your plan A? And really identify and fall back on plan A.
I think that's well said. Do you find that it's well received? Is this message resonating when you kind of give it to young, enthusiastic athletes?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, Dr. Betty. Absolutely wonderful question. Honestly, when you are, let me step back. How do I want to answer that question? I will say sometimes and maybe it's well received. And I'll share with you what I mean by that. If you've got a starry-eyed young man that's probably recognized for their athletic ability, I think about my son. In his junior year of high school, he was getting all types of interest in terms of colleges looking at him, wanting him to come or to go and play for their school. And then he gets to the college level and he's doing real well and he's the starter and his name is plastered, on the billboard. It's a little bit difficult to start talking about reality.
Yeah.
When you are achieving and seeing that success. So that's the reason why I say sometimes. That's where I think it's important to engage the family. And sometimes that can be somewhat of a challenge as well. Yeah. And to start very, very early with not to in any way damper their enthusiasm, but to give good fact and information. And usually when they're approaching more of that draft day, and perhaps the name hasn't been called and it's the third or fourth round, reality starts to sink in.
Yeah. It's such, when you think of the numbers of young men playing football at all levels, the pyramid gets so narrow at the top of it that I assume that the number of broken hearts and shattered dreams way out kind of numbers the fortunate and talented young men who actually make it into the league.
Yes, there's disappointment there. And I think, I see that disappointment sometimes in two ways. One of the things my son said to me after draft day, that's a whole different story about our draft experience. But at the end, he said, Mom, I wasn't a top round draft pick, but I just wanted to hear my name called. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was very, very important to him. Hearing his name called and being recognized as one of the best, because he had been working so hard for that all of his life. So that was extremely important. And then I think the other piece of it is once you've heard that name called and you're on the field, understanding that the longevity of this is very, very short.
Yeah.
So sometimes you get to that level and then you don't make the team. Just because you're drafted does not mean you make the team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So sometimes it can be a little bit deflating in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's so interesting to hear you really tell this compelling story, but it's one of reality, right? And bringing these young men who have potentially really great opportunity in front of them, a dose of reality around it may be a means to an end for you. It may get you into college. It may give you a step up. It may give you some notoriety, some advancement, lots of opportunity that you might not otherwise have. And yet there is that real need for what is plan B good? If plan B doesn't play out here, how is plan A going to come back to the focus? And recognizing that they really need to keep in balance those two different aspects of their career life. To your point around the longevity isn't always there. Just back to this Harvard study for a moment. It'd be interesting to see, based on the results that came out of that, are you optimistic that change is going to come to the healthcare environment and to the disparities that some of these individuals have experienced themselves?
I am optimistic, and I say that not to be over enthusiastic. There's a lot of work to be done. But I think where we are at this moment is there's visibility that we have to the disparities that maybe we haven't had in the past. We're having this conversation. Companies like NextGen that's starting the dialogue, the conversation, and having commitment to having initiatives to work on the better outcomes. Education. I think COVID is an excellent example of bringing disparities to the light and to the forefront. And again, getting that conversation, the stirring up of what this actually means. So when I look at that and I look at what's being done, what I anticipate that can be done moving forward, I am optimistic. It's going to take some time. It's not, we may be having this conversation next year and the year after that. Yep. But I am optimistic that there's opportunity for change, and change will come.
Well, to build on that, Joanne, I think what you stated 10 minutes ago with regard to really the long-standing historic biases that have been in place with regard to how people of different races have been able to access and how they've been treated by the healthcare system. Those, just because there's a conversation now, doesn't mean those things change rapidly. And that this is a much more long-term evolution that the healthcare system and American society overall really needs to get their hands around and be willing and committed to shifting what the outcomes are going to be before there's significant change that occurs. Knowing what you know today in terms of the work you've been doing, would you still support your son's journey going into the NFL? Was that the right thing for him?
Oh, I love this question because I'm asked this question on a regular basis. And let me start off with a simple one-word answer, and then I'll explain. The answer is yes.
Okay, good.
And many are shocked by that answer. I will say that what I do know now is that there's more visibility, more education, and more awareness of the impact of these players, to the players, short and long term, than there's ever been. If my son Jordan were just starting into the sport right now, I'd be even more open to it than I was 18 years ago. There's more information out there to those that are caregivers and supporters of the players around overall health and wellness. And I think there's more self-advocacy the players really advocating for their overall health and well-being that had not taken place a number of years ago. So the question was, would I say yes? Yes. When I speak with moms and families about their children now, they ask me that question, and I say yes, if that's something that your child is very, very interested in doing. However, I think do not lose sight of that parental guidance and responsibility to keep encouraging them to be an advocate for themselves, for their overall health.
Very good.
Great. This has been a terrific conversation. I obviously have lots of other questions for another conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joanne, and helping us shed light on an important aspect of healthcare disparities in a very unique population of elite athletes and their families. Thank you also to our listeners. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, consider subscribing to our podcast. This is Dr. Betty Rabinowitz with NextGen Healthcare. Thank you as well, Graham Brown, for joining us today, and have a great day.